Hi again. Okay, this is part 2 of your feedback video. I apologize for that. I got interrupted. But so we've moved on to why the problem needs solving. And I think this is a good paragraph. You integrate evidence really well. This is underlined because cannot is one word. But here you're talking about obviously why the problem needs solving. I might just put this as like why sexual abuse in the workplace needs solving or something like that. And I just want to make sure this is centered. There we go. And then that comma's not needed. The only thing I recommend adding to this paragraph, and some numbers that I think overall are needed, but your intro doesn't really have the space for it, so this paragraph here seems like the next natural place to put it, are percentages of sexual abuse. Like, obviously we'll never know like an exact percentage of how many people are abused, how many of them are men, how many of them are women, how many of them are trans, right? How many of them are gay. Like, we'll never know the different numbers, but there has to be some guesstimates in terms of what's the percentage of people that are sexually harassed in the workplace every year. That kind of information is needed because that will bring a little bit more gravitas to the problem itself. And sexual harassment is one of those things that people always think because it's such an old issue that it doesn't exist. Well, people know it exists, but I don't think people know the extent to which it exists. So bringing in that type of evidence would be really useful for your argument in terms of what the scope of the problem actually looks like. And I'm sure there are numbers that break that down even further, in terms of not only what the percentage of or how many people suffer from sexual harassment in the workplace every year, but how many of them are women, how many of them are men, how many of them are trans, how many of them are gay, how many of them are disabled, whatever it is. But, sorry, I'm such a nitpicky punctuation person. Seeing things everywhere. So this would be a really good place to put this because you're talking about why the problem needs solved. And the other thing that I think needs to go in this paragraph is that I don't think you talk about in your paper. You talk about, I think you allude to it in your the potential solutions. But the thing that you're kind of skirting around, but you're not addressing explicitly, is the fact that there is federal legislation in place that requires companies to provide sexual harassment training. So you probably want to include that as a potential solution because that's something that the federal government has done, as well as they've passed the VAWA Act, the Violence Against Women Act, and the Title IX as well. So Title VII and Title IX, the VAWA Act, are all federal legislations that are enforced across the United States that make it mandatory for training to happen. But, right, the argument here is even though this legislation is in place and even though employers are beholden to their employees to provide sexual harassment training, sexual harassment still happens. So that would be information you can include in the potential solutions, or even possibly where you refute possible objections, because I don't think anyone is going to say, no, sexual harassment in the workplace does not need solved, right? People are going to say that. So for this paragraph here, you could talk about like, people may believe that everything that can be done to solve sexual harassment in the workplace has been done through these various federal legislation, such as Title IX, Title VII, the VAWA Act, and mandatory sexual harassment training. However, in light of this legislation, and I don't know what they were all passed at in different years, so and you'd want to identify, the years in which they were passed, right? But in light of, all of this legislation, this percentage of people are still sexually harassed in the workplace every year. So, and then sometimes comparative analyses are really helpful in this case. So, for example, like, you probably don't want to look at like 50 years, because that wouldn't be helpful because of, the recent movements in feminism and in women in the workplace, and which are kind of more like 1980s on. So it might just be like looking at the 21st century, so like the 2000 to 2019. But like in like the last 10 or 20 years, has there been a decrease in those percentages or numbers of how many people have, or come forward, or what the guesstimate, what people are suggesting in terms of how many people are in fact victims of sexual harassment in the workplace. So that would be definitely information that would be really helpful to your paper here, and I think that would be really useful in this refutation paragraph, where you're kind of focusing on like the scale or the spectrum of punishment, but in terms of like how that affects the individual, like the perpetrator or the abuser. But I think a more pertinent refutation would be, yes, the number, in the past 20 years, there's been a decrease in sexual harassment cases or reportings of sexual harassment in the workplace, due to, arguably due to federal legislation passed in 1970, 1980, whenever they were created. VAWA is a much more recent, I want to say in the last 20 years, if less than that, the Violence Against Women Act. But yes, there is a decrease in percentage, but it's like, why is it still happening? So it's that would be kind of the refutation is, yeah, there's this legislation, and I have no idea, and I'm just presuming what the numbers look like because I have no idea. But what do the numbers look like? And even if they are decreasing, that's still a problem because it's still happening. If they're increasing, that's an even worse problem. And then refuting that is really easy, right? Because then you say, well, then clearly it's not enough. Like, this legislation is not significant enough, right? So maybe it's not just about training people in the workforce about what sexual harassment looks like. How does somebody know when they're being sexually harassed? What do they do? Like, there's a whole, like, I've been trained on it. I've been trained in Title VII and Title IX and VAWA and sexual harassment. I'm a mandated reporter. So I'm trained on how to do mandated reporting, which is when somebody comes to me with claims of sexual harassment. I'm then required to do certain things. So I've had a lot of training in it, but my personal experience is that people either don't recognize what sexual harassment is, because when people actually learn what sexual harassment is, which can be as something as seemingly simple as telling somebody that they like their outfit, right? Because you're not supposed to comment on the body at all. To more, people sometimes see sexual harassment as, if you don't have sex with me, I'm going to fire you. It's like, that's kind of an extreme case, but there's much more implicit, what we would call insidious sexual harassment, which is where you might comment on someone's hair, or comment on what they're wearing, or, talk about the cute guy on the 6th floor. Like, those are all examples of sexual harassment. So it does come down to educating people about sexual harassment. And one of the other, and this is, like I said, this is just my personal experience, but then the other thing that tends to hold people back is fear of retaliation. So, and it's that, the curse of the whistleblower, that people fear that if I come forward, that I am even if I come out and say, this person did this to me, I feel wronged, they might feel like their work might retaliate against them, and they may be in a position to lose their job. So it's really about empowering the employees to not feel threatened when it comes to these types of things. So, but that's just to give you a kind of, in talking about, so here I mentioned in your, this kind of why this thing needs solving, giving some evidence as to what the actual scope of sexual harassment in the workplace looks like. So, every year, X number of people, right, are harassed. There's going to be numbers on that. And then detailing those potential solutions. Then I went to the refutation, right, bringing up that, and also in the potential solution. So here you talk about, in the workplace, people need to know they are safe. To accomplish this, employees need to be assured that, I think you mean that they will be taken care of. That's kind of a redundant sentence there, because you've already said that in the previous one about them being safe. To give employees the courage to speak out, right? This is about empowerment. So, right, to empower employees, and this is also editing for concision. Empowering employees to speak out about their abuse is the first step. Another great way to help monitor abuse is to have employees complete anonymous surveys to gauge whether the power is misused in the company, right? So you have this quotation here. There are, I would just say, it's one word instead of three. There are many, I would say, alternative solutions that might possibly help someone in this situation. For example, one way of dealing with a lot of bad behavior that's not bad enough to be reportable is to turn the tables. And here I would quote, because it's idiomatic here, but it's also from the quotation, would be to do the same thing they are doing to the employer. I don't know. I'm presuming that's what that means. This is only possible with minor issues, such as an employee who constantly badgers an employer or a manager to do unnecessary things for them. That just feels toxic. I don't know if it's a solution, but that might be a here's how we fix things in a toxic way, because turning the tables is not necessarily a great potential solution. But I think what's missing from your potential solutions is that they're through federal legislation, that is aimed at educating. I don't know about empowering, but it's definitely about educating. I think implicitly it's about empowering people. I don't think historically yet. I think it will soon be about empowering, but I don't know that it's yet gotten there. So the federal legislation that mandates how sexual, like what, and this goes down to the HR, human resources, or the departments that have to give out these trainings. So the potential solutions, there is something in place that legislation already has, which is, and if you've had sexual harassment training, but what it is essentially is educating people on it and kind of saying like, hey, if something happens, you need to tell somebody. And if you tell a mandated reporter, you need to know that that mandated reporter is required to report it, so that action can be taken. So that's what's missing from here, from your detailed potential solutions. When you talk about the best solution, and here's where you say, is to assure staff that investigations into misuse of power will be handled promptly, fairly, and confidentially. The workplace should be trained on how to appropriately handle a situation of abuse. So I would say that the only thing here that's missing is it's very similar to the fact that you're leaving out conversations about what's already happening, but this is happening with Title IX investigations. So the goal is to, with Title IX, and there are what are called Title IX coordinators that handle these investigations, and they're supposed to handle them promptly, fairly, and confidentially. Obviously, and confidentiality is it's all for legal reasons. So you might look more at that to be more specific about the best solution, and what's missing also from the best solution is how do we make assurances that that is happening? Because I can tell you that I have been witness to Title IX investigations that have not been handled fairly, and that have not been handled promptly and confidentially. People talk, so that's a hard one. But I have been witness to several Title IX investigations that have not been handled promptly, fairly, or confidentially. So how do we assure that they are handled? And I would bring up Title IX. That Title IX investigations, which are investigations into sexual harassment claims, how do we assure that those investigations are handled in those ways? So that's what's missing from your best solution. I talked about your paragraph here. You don't need a conclusion, so because your conclusion essentially is your call to action. So you could potentially, especially given the suggested revision I have for that, you could bring that in there before you talk about the potential solutions. So that could go there, and then that would make more sense, because then you would just talk about potential solutions, and then you talk about the best solution. And I would just say, like, the best solution. And here, you can just, I don't know if you're centering it by doing it that way, but I would just do it like that. Okay, so that's everything I'm going to say, because I don't want to overwhelm you with information. But if you have any questions, or before I go on, if I can do this correctly, there we go. References doesn't get bold-faced. Alphabetize, which is good. This looks good. Okay, looks good. All right. So if you have any questions about anything that I talked about in these 2 videos, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I wish you luck in your revision. Thanks, Victoria.